Gary Gomes. I'm here to talk with you again about astrology, specifically Vedic astrology. We'll be expanding our coverage to include other forms of astrology over the next few weeks, but for now we're going to stick with Indian or Vedic astrology, the astrology from India. Last week I gave an overview of the charts and the signs and the planets to a very light extent. This week I'd like to go into the houses in the Vedic chart, or in Indian astrology chart, and also go into the planets in more detail. So this should be a relatively brief lecture. I'd also like to talk very briefly towards the end about the fire at Notre Dame, which occurred April 15th. It's April 16th when I'm taping, so it's actually a fairly recent event. So, and you can see from the chart that we'll be talking about where the planetary factors figure in that particular catastrophe. The Vedic astrology has, like Western astrology, has a system of houses. Houses govern certain domains of life. So essentially, when you're looking at a house is essentially a place where you put things, right? It's a place where you live, it's a place where you house your family, house your dog, house your possessions. And astrology breaks houses into different facets of life. So the first house has to do with the head, and thinking it loosely corresponds with the sign Aries. The second house has to do with the person's face, essentially what they look like, how they speak, how they express themselves, is connected often with the person's physical appearance. And if the person has a nice or pleasant to look at first house, the person will be attractive. If the person has a not so nice to look at first house, they may be smart, but maybe perhaps not so attractive. But also, the second house governs things like speech, how we express ourselves to people, how we relate to people. So it's a very important house. It's also the house connected with money. So essentially, if you want to look at how wealthy the person's family is in particular, or the person's personal assets, that is the amount of money they present to you or they provide to people, you look at the second house. So it's a house connected with family, with intimate family. It's also connected with food. So let's say if a person has good eating habits, they'll have a good second house. If they have poor eating habits, they'll have a bad second house. And what I mean by poor and bad, by good and bad, I'll get into later on. The third house has to do with the body parts connected with the shoulders, to a certain extent, the neck, the arms, and the chest. So it's essentially the hands and what we reach for, what we grab for. So it roughly corresponds to the sign Gemini, or Matuna, as they call it in Indian astrology, and is connected with desires, what we want. It's also connected with brothers, sisters, siblings in particular. So whenever we see, and also with courage, and so whenever we see a third house in the chart, it has to do with basically the things that we communicate with, but also the things that we're actually actively striving for, or actually actively reaching for. The fourth house is Cancer. It's our heart, it's our mother, it's the things that make us comfortable in this lifetime. And it also has to do essentially with basic education, so the education of our community, our surroundings. In contemporary society in the United States, let's say, we have fourth house often corresponds to college education, or whether or not we go successfully through our educational cycle, our basic educational cycle. And I'm not talking about advanced degrees, I'm talking about like high school, bachelor's degree maybe. But if we go to advanced degrees, we're talking about the ninth house. We'll talk about that in a second. The fifth house has to do basically with our stomachs, but also it has to do with our children. Children largely come from that part of the body, and it also has to do with what they call purva punya, or past life credit. Past life credit often translates into something that we call intelligence in life. So essentially, if a person has a good fifth house, they have good, what we would call gut instincts in astrology. So the fifth house has to do with essentially, so the first house is the mind, so that's how the person thinks, but it's not the skill the person exhibits in thinking. So they may have a good first house, and they may be really, really smart, but if they express it, they'll express it through the fifth house. They'll express it through how they interact with people, how they deal with people. The fifth house is also a house of enjoyment, things we like to do. It's also a house, and it's mainly because we've done them, at least according to the Hindus, in previous lifetimes. This is our credit. These are the things that we've involved ourselves in previous lifetimes intimately. But also, the fifth house has to do with overall politics, how we deal with people, how others feel around us, how we interact with people. So oftentimes in politicians' charts, you'll see very strong fifth houses. And the fifth house essentially also has to do with whether or not a person is likable, whether or not they get elected easily, whether or not they're popular, those kinds of things. Coming right off the fifth house is essentially the sixth house, which has to do with our digestive system. So it corresponds, so the fifth house corresponds to Leo, which is a kingship sign. The sixth house corresponds to Virgo, which is essentially a purification sign. Now the sixth house is kind of an interesting house because it gives us the enemies we have in life, but it also gives us the ways we overcome enemies. So it's the house in which we digest our food. So if you see a person who has bad eating habits, or they take bad things, like you'll see people with, let's say, with drug addictions or with problems with digestion, those will come about connected with the sixth house. But it's a house connected with purification. And it's also a house connected with winning things or realizing ambitions. So it's a competitive house. It's a house connected with ambition, drive. You have to beat your own shortcomings before you can win. You have to beat your opponents. So it's a house of enemies. But all these things are necessary in order to achieve victory, okay? The seventh house is connected with long-term relationships. So after we've done all this work on ourselves, we've had the first half of life, or the first part of the chart, has to do with self, food, basic necessities, money, siblings, mother, past life credit, things we come to easily. Sixth house has to do with obstacles or barriers, things we have to overcome. After we overcome those things, we turn our attention to other people. So the seventh house is a house of partnerships. It corresponds to the sign Libra. Libra is considered in Western astrology to be a romantic sign. It's a sign of compromise. It's a sign connected with partnerships overall, okay? So it's not only romantic partnerships, it's also business partnerships. So it will give you an idea of the kind of business you'll end up in. And they have a system in India called derived houses. And a derived house, the concept is called bhavat bhavam, or house to house. So the 10th house, which we haven't gone to yet, is a house of career. The 10th from the 10th house is the 7th house. So you count 10, 11, 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's 10 altogether. So the 7th house is what's called the secondary career house. So it's the career of the career. So it's the progress you make in your career life. So we look at the 7th house for career matters too. The 8th house is a house of hidden enemies or obstacles, and also the spouse's money. It corresponds directly to Scorpio in the chart. It has a rough affiliation with Scorpio. And it's hidden matters. It's the part of the body we really can't get to that easily. It's the part of the body none of us can ever see, because it has to do with the sexual organs, has to do with the elimination parts of the body. And those things are the things that we actually never, we can see the former, but unless we have like extraordinarily flexible bodies, we never see the latter. So essentially, that's where the things go essentially to be gotten rid of. It's the waste in our lives, but it's also, because it's the second from the 7th house, it's also the relationship partner's money. All right, the 9th house has to do with father. So it just as the 4th house has to do with mother, the 9th house has to do with father. And it's also the house of spiritual teachings, religion to a certain extent, of spiritual teachers or gurus they would have in India, and also whatever kind of religious institution that you can think of. So any kind of like a formal religious institution or higher knowledge. It also corresponds roughly with higher education. And higher education is considered a function of spiritual life in India, is considered a function of, so let's say a person gets a doctoral degree. I have a doctoral degree, I'm not boasting, I just have it. But the 9th house essentially comes into play in terms of obtaining doctoral degrees or master's degrees, those kinds of things. And essentially, if the 9th house is weak, that part of life tends to get pushed back to a certain extent. So I didn't get my doctoral degree until I was fairly late in life. Some people get it when they're in their 20s. And essentially the main reason for that is because certain planets will aspect that house and just push it back and push it back and push it back. So if you're looking at a chart and you're wondering to yourself, why didn't I achieve that degree or that function in life? Sometimes aspects in the chart will be causing that, sometimes the condition of the Lord of the 9th house. So we're going to talk about house lordships in a little while, but the Lord of the 9th house. And also sometimes Saturn will delay the assumption of degrees. And basically planets have individual natures. And I'm going to try to put those together for you before the end of this session. The 10th house has to do with our action in the world. So 9th house is Dharma, essentially what we've learned, what we've picked, what we've moved forward with. 10th house has to do with action in the world. So that's the house of karma. Karma has gotten, I think there's a better understanding of it now than there was when I encountered the term earlier in my life. But karma is essentially, it's value neutral. And what I mean by that is, it's the action you actually take. So it's not necessarily, you've done karma, you're going to suffer for this. People can do good things, they can do bad things. There are consequences connected with those acts. And I can boil it down to a very simple example. If you don't eat enough food, you'll lose weight, right? If you eat too much food, you'll gain weight, without appropriate exercise. Those are both karmas. So essentially, or if you don't pay your bills, things will be taken away from you. If you do pay your bills, you'll keep things. So essentially, those are the results of karma. They're value neutral. There can be bad karmas, but we're not talking in terms of like great evil people like Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin or a dictator or somebody who's taken a lot of lives. We're talking about just like simple acts. So if we do something, there's a result and a consequence. The consequence can be good. The consequence can be difficult. It's essentially, like I said, it's value neutral. And there are certain laws in place in the universe. And when you break them down, they're very common sense laws. They're not really like all these obscure, like weird little things. If you do something, a certain result will occur. That's karma. The 11th house, so that corresponds to Capricorn, that corresponds to the practical level of life that we all function in. The 9th house corresponds to Sagittarius. I apologize, I didn't say that before. The 11th house corresponds to Aquarius. And so we're talking about Sagittarius, we're talking about this part of the body, we're talking about Capricorn, it's the knees, and we're talking about Aquarius, it's the calves, okay? And Aquarius is essentially the sign of friends, gains, aspirations, long-term aspirations. So in some ways, it's a reflection of the 3rd house, which is short-term aspirations and short-term trips. But the 11th house has to do with gains from work. So it's the 10th house through the 11th house, so it's second from the 10th house. So it's gains from work. And it also has to do with friends. Friends are people that we know that we don't necessarily live with. Okay, family are people we know that we actually live with. Sometimes people feel closer to their friends than their family. That does show up in the chart, okay, when we're looking at an astrology chart. So you may see a negative planet connected with your family. You may see a positive planet connected with your friends, and that's terrific. And the other way around is terrific as well. So essentially, you'll get support from some part of life. The 12th house has to do with the feet. So it's where things end. It's where we essentially say goodbye to things. It's where we sleep. It's the part of the body we probably pay the least attention to unless we have sore aching feet. And essentially it's the part of the body which has to do with liberation or moksha to the Indians, and it has to do with spiritual enlightenment, and it has to do with all these wonderful things. But it's also a house of letting go. So it's a house of expenses. So just as the 11th house is gains, the 12th house is expenses, or it's a house of loss. Now, loss in our society is often deemed to be a bad thing. Loss to a spiritual person is actually deemed to be a good thing because they don't want a lot of attachments. They don't want to be tied to their possessions. They want to be able to meditate and get closer to God. So so the house of loss can actually be good, but in terms of real life experience, it's a bit difficult, to be quite honest. So you see people with planets in the 6th, the